He thought he would bring a joyful surprise to his wife and daughter after his business trip, but what he discovered in that house was the beginning of an unending nightmare. Shay, his wife, was lying in bed with a smug young man. The heartbreak grew even deeper when his daughter, Lacey, also betrayed the trust he had always placed in her. But this is not a story about collapse. This is a story about how Jack took back control of his life, about the difficult but necessary decisions he made to confront the pain and move forward. But before diving into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next ones. Crazy as it sounds, the next episode of Before the Crazy is about to end way better. The glow of the moon filtered through the tall windows of the suburban home, casting long shadows across the living room. Jack Hayes stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender from a nearby diffuser mixing with the faint aroma of something burnt in the air. His carry-on bag thudded softly on the floor as he closed the door behind him, careful not to make a sound. Jack, a 42-year-old project manager at a growing tech company, had spent the last 4 days locked in tense negotiations with a new client on the West Coast. The deal was a success, a solid victory in his book, and he'd decided to catch an earlier flight back. A fun surprise, he'd thought. His wife, Shay, and their 17-year-old daughter, Lacey, were his world. The very reasons he worked long hours and traveled so frequently. "I thought it'd be a fun surprise for my wife, Shay, and our daughter, Lacey," Jack muttered under his breath. Instead, it was the kind of surprise that makes you wish you never left the airport. The house was eerily quiet. Normally, Shay would be bustling around the kitchen or catching up on her fashion blog projects, something she'd started during the pandemic that turned into a thriving side hustle. Lacey might be in her room scrolling through social media or FaceTiming her friends. The unmistakable sound of giggles seeping through her door. Tonight, though, something felt off. Jack's footsteps barely made a sound as he made his way past the living room and up the staircase. The dim lighting added to his unease, but he brushed it off. Maybe they'd gone to bed early, he reasoned. He didn't want to overthink it. He wanted to see Shay's face light up when she saw him. As he reached the top of the stairs, Jack paused. A muffled laugh caught his attention, low and flirtatious, coming from the master bedroom. It wasn't Shay's usual laugh. His chest tightened, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The laugh wasn't alone. There was another voice, a man's, younger, confident, almost arrogant. Jack's mind reeled as he tried to process the sound. His heart pounded in his ears as he tiptoed closer. Could it be the TV? Maybe Shay had fallen asleep watching a show and he was jumping to conclusions. Yet something about the cadence of the voices told him otherwise. The hallway felt longer than usual as Jack approached the door. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle, pushing it open just enough to peer inside. The dim light of a bedside lamp illuminated a scene that froze him in place. Shay was in bed, her auburn hair sprawled across the pillow, laughing softly as a man leaned close to her. The stranger, who couldn't have been older than 25, lounged comfortably beside her, his shirt half-buttoned, a smug grin on his face. Jack didn't move. He didn't say a word. The betrayal hit him like a physical blow, each second stretching painfully into eternity. "I thought catching your wife in bed with someone else was the worst thing," Jack thought bitterly. "I was wrong." The sound of their laughter grated on him as he stood there, invisible to them both. Jack swallowed hard, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to burst into the room, to demand answers, but a wave of icy calm washed over him. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a scene. Not tonight. Turning on his heel, Jack walked away, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the hallway, a sliver of light under another door caught his eye. Lacey's room. His hand raised instinctively, knocking softly. "Lacey?" he called, his voice just above a whisper. The door creaked open moments later, revealing his daughter. She was sitting too close to a boy Jack didn't recognize, their guilty expressions betraying whatever excuse they were about to give. "What are you doing home, Dad?" Lacey asked, her tone defiant. Jack stared at her, his jaw tightening. The warm welcome he'd imagined hours ago was gone, replaced by a cold, unsettling reality. Jack froze on the landing, his ears straining to decipher the sound coming from behind the closed door of the master bedroom. Laughter, soft, intimate, and undeniably flirtatious, floated through the crack in the door. His heart sank as he recognized Shay's voice, but it wasn't her usual warm, melodic laugh. This was different, carefree, teasing. And then he heard it, the unmistakable voice of a man responding, his tone cocky and young. Jack's breath hitched. There was another voice, he thought, his stomach churning. Younger, confident. Max, I learned later, was his name. For a moment he stood there, frozen, gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles turned white. He told himself he could be wrong. Maybe she was on the phone. Maybe it was just a movie playing in the background. He wanted to believe it, but the nagging voice in his head wouldn't let him. Every instinct screamed for him to leave, to turn around and pretend he never came home early. But Jack was a man who faced problems head-on, or at least he had been. Swallowing hard, he stepped closer to the door, his shoes silent against the carpeted floor. The door was ajar, leaving a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. As he approached, the sound of their voices grew louder, clearer. Jack hesitated, his hand hovering near the doorknob, his chest tightening with each shallow breath. Just look, he told himself. It's better to know than to wonder. Slowly, almost painfully, he nudged the door open an inch further. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and there they were. Shay lay tangled in the white duvet, her hair a tousled halo against the pillows, her face flushed with a glow Jack hadn't seen in years. Beside her, a shirtless man sat propped up on one elbow, his lean frame and confident smirk making him look almost like a caricature of youthful arrogance. Max leaned closer to Shay, whispering something that made her laugh, a sound that now felt like a dagger plunging into Jack's chest. The world seemed to stop. Jack's mind struggled to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. He didn't feel the anger or outrage he'd always imagined would come with betrayal. Instead, a hollow numbness settled over him, spreading through his limbs. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the conversation between the two. They didn't notice him. Not even a flicker of awareness crossed their faces. Jack took a step back, the movement so measured and deliberate it surprised even him. He didn't barge in, didn't scream or demand answers. What would that accomplish? Instead, he let the door fall softly back into place and turned to leave, his legs moving on autopilot. Jack's thoughts swirled as he descended the stairs, gripping the railing to steady himself. This is my life, he thought, the realization hitting him like a blow. And I'm a stranger in it. The front door shut behind him with a quiet click. Jack stepped into the cool night air, his breath fogging in the glow of the streetlights. For the first time in his life, he didn't know where to go. Jack stepped back into the house, his heart heavy and his mind clouded with disbelief. He hadn't planned to come back inside. He wanted nothing more than to keep walking into the night. But something about the faint glow from under Lacey's door drew him back. It was a sliver of normalcy in a house that suddenly felt like a stranger's. Out of habit, he approached the door and knocked lightly. The murmur of voices inside abruptly stopped. Jack's brow furrowed. Lacey rarely had friends over this late on a school night, especially not unannounced. He knocked again, a little harder this time. "Lacey?" he called, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling inside him. After a long pause, the door creaked open just enough for Lacey's face to appear, her expression guarded. Jack immediately noticed the boy behind her, sitting on her bed, his posture stiff, clearly caught off guard. "Dad?" Lacey's tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "What are you doing home?" Jack blinked, startled by the question. He hadn't expected hostility, let alone defiance. "I live here," he replied, his voice low, measured. "Who's he?" The boy, a lanky teenager who couldn't have been more than 18, shifted uncomfortably under Jack's gaze. He looked at Lacey for reassurance, but she only crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, blocking Jack from stepping inside. "We were just hanging out, the boy, Lucas," Jack would later learn, said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to sound nonchalant. Jack's jaw tightened. The sight of Lucas on Lacey's bed, coupled with the events of the past 10 minutes, pushed his patience to its limit. "Get out," he said, his voice firm and cold. Lucas hesitated, glancing at Lacey as if hoping she'd intervene. When she didn't, Jack took a step forward, and that was all it took. Lucas scrambled off the bed, grabbing his jacket and muttering an awkward, "Sorry, sir," as he slipped past Jack and down the stairs. Lacey, unbothered, watched Lucas go before turning her gaze back to Jack. Her smirk was faint but unmistakable. "It's not a big deal, Dad. Chill." Jack stared at her, incredulous. "Not a big deal? You had a boy in your room, on your bed, with the door closed, and it's a school night." Lacey shrugged, her posture dripping with indifference. "So, it's not like we were doing anything." Jack ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. "Your mother and I raised you better than this." That's when Lacey's expression changed. The smirk widened into something sharper, more cutting. "Guess you didn't raise her that well either." The words hit Jack like a slap. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He stared at his daughter, searching for some trace of the girl he'd always known, but she only held his gaze, defiant and unflinching. "Good night, Dad," she said, closing the door in his face without waiting for a response. Jack stood there, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. Slowly, he turned and walked away, his feet dragging as if the air in the house had turned thick, suffocating. Whatever sense of control he thought he had left was slipping away. Jack climbed the stairs with deliberate, heavy steps, the weight of the night pressing harder with each step. The echoes of Lacey's sharp words still rang in his ears, fueling the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say to Shay, but he knew he couldn't leave the house without facing her, without making it clear that he wasn't the fool they seemed to think he was. As he reached the top of the stairs, the door to the master bedroom opened suddenly. Shay stepped out, her robe haphazardly thrown on, her hair a mess of hurriedly smoothed strands. Her face was pale, her usual poise shattered. For a moment, they stood in silence, the tension between them so thick it was suffocating. "Jack," she started, her voice shaky but laced with defensiveness. "I can't explain." Jack held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. His expression was cold, his eyes unreadable. "Don't bother," he said flatly, his voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't anger that spoke. It was exhaustion, the kind that came from realizing the life he thought he knew had crumbled in the span of an hour. Shay's mouth opened as if to protest, but she quickly closed it. She stepped toward him, her hands clutching the edges of her robe tightly, as if holding herself together. "It's not what it looked like," she said hurriedly, her tone growing desperate. "Max, he doesn't mean anything. It's just been—" Jack moved past her without another word, his shoulder brushing hers as he strode toward the guest room. He didn't need her excuses. He didn't need her lies. All he needed right now was distance. Shay followed him a few steps, her bare feet padding softly on the floor. "Jack, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "We can talk about this. I didn't mean for—" The sound of the guest room door closing and the sharp click of the lock cut her off. Jack leaned against the door for a moment, his breathing steady but shallow. The numbness from earlier was giving way to a dull ache in his chest, but he shoved the feeling aside. There was no time for heartbreak, not tonight. On the other side of the door, he could hear Shay's muffled voice, alternating between apologies and attempts to justify herself. He ignored her, walking to the bed and sinking onto the edge of the mattress. His eyes landed on the suitcase he'd left unpacked downstairs, a cruel reminder of the life he thought he was returning to. For now, he couldn't think about tomorrow. He couldn't think about Lacey or Shay or the betrayal that now defined his home. He closed his eyes and let the silence of the room surround him, shutting out the noise of the night and the world that no longer made sense. The pale light of dawn seeped through the blinds in the guest room, casting long shadows across the walls. Jack's eyes fluttered open, the dull ache in his chest quickly returning as reality sank in. For a brief moment, he'd forgotten where he was, but the sterile, impersonal surroundings of the guest room quickly reminded him. He sat up, rubbing his temples, trying to push away the events of the previous night. But no amount of effort could erase the image of Shay in bed with another man, or the cutting defiance in Lacey's voice. Jack knew there was no going back to how things were. Moving with quiet determination, he pulled a small suitcase from the corner of the room and began packing. Suits, neatly folded, a few shirts and ties, his laptop and the charger, the essentials. Each item he packed felt like another step away from the life he had spent years building. The wedding band on his finger caught the morning light as he zipped the suitcase, and for a moment, he paused. The weight of the ring suddenly felt unbearable. Jack stood, his gaze drawn to the framed wedding photo on the wall just outside the guest room door. He had seen it countless times over the years, always with a sense of pride. The image showed Shay and him on a sunny afternoon, both smiling as if the world couldn't touch them. Now, that smile felt like a mockery. He approached the photo slowly, his footsteps light against the hardwood floor. For a moment, he let his hand linger on the frame, the cool glass beneath his fingers. Memories of their wedding day flickered in his mind, uninvited. The vows, the laughter, the promises that now felt hollow. I used to love that photo, he thought, his lips tightening into a grim line, but now it feels like a bad joke. With deliberate care, Jack pulled the frame from the wall and set it face down on the console table below. The sound of glass meeting wood was softer than he expected, but it felt final. He stared at it for a moment longer before turning away. The house was silent as he descended the stairs, his suitcase rolling softly behind him. No sounds from Shay, no movements from Lacey. It was better this way. The last thing he wanted was another confrontation, another reminder of how far his family had fallen. Outside, the crisp morning air stung his face as he loaded his suitcase into the car. He paused, taking one last look at the house he had called home for over a decade. It no longer felt like his. Without a second thought, he climbed into the driver's seat and pulled away, the house shrinking in his rearview mirror. 15 minutes later, Jack stood in the quiet lobby of a nearby hotel. The receptionist greeted him warmly, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. He checked in, the keycard cool and smooth in his hand. Upstairs in his room, Jack set his suitcase down, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared out the window at the unfamiliar view. For the first time in years, Jack was alone, with nothing but his thoughts and the uncertain future ahead. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of Jack's hotel room as he sat at the small desk, phone in hand. A steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched beside him, its bitter aroma doing little to lighten the weight on his chest. He stared at the banking app on his screen, his thumb hovering over the support button. This isn't about revenge, Jack told himself, exhaling slowly. It's about protecting what's mine. With a final nod of resolve, he tapped the button and waited as the call connected. The banker's polite voice on the other end greeted him, and Jack wasted no time explaining his request. "I need to revoke access to all shared accounts, credit cards, and savings immediately," he said, his tone clipped but calm. "My wife, Shay, is not to have access to any of it." There was a pause as the banker processed the request. "I understand, Mr. Hayes. May I confirm the accounts you'd like to update?" Jack rattled off the details with the efficiency of a man who had planned this in his mind overnight. As the banker confirmed the changes, Jack leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The act of cutting Shay off financially felt surreal, but necessary. She'd have enough in her personal account for basic needs, but not much more. He wasn't going to leave her stranded. But luxuries? Those were gone. She'd have enough cash for groceries, he thought coldly. But that was it. Once the call ended, Jack turned his attention to the next step. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number of a divorce lawyer he'd bookmarked months ago, back when marital tensions first began to brew. He hesitated for a brief moment before pressing the call button. This step, unlike the bank, felt far more permanent. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," the lawyer said after introductions were exchanged. "What can I do for you?" Jack laid it all out: the infidelity, the fractured home, the need to protect his assets. He spared no details, his voice steady as he recounted the events of the previous night. Each word felt like a dagger in his chest, but he kept going, knowing the truth needed to be said. "This will take time," the lawyer replied after a pause, her tone professional yet reassuring. "But we'll make sure you're protected. Based on what you've described, custody over your assets shouldn't be an issue." Jack felt a flicker of relief, though it was fleeting. "And Shay?" he asked. "How messy are we looking at this getting?" "It depends on her response. But with what you've shared, we're in a strong position," she said. "If you're ready, I'll start drafting the necessary documents." "Do it," Jack replied firmly. As he ended the call, Jack leaned back in the chair, staring out the window at the unfamiliar skyline. The decisions he'd made that morning were just the beginning of what promised to be a long, grueling process. Still, for the first time in days, he felt a sliver of control return to his life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. Jack's phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, the persistent hum breaking through the quiet of his hotel room. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he sat at the small desk, poring over the notes his lawyer had sent, sipping on yet another cup of bitter coffee. The messages and calls had started earlier that morning and hadn't let up since. Shay's name flashed on the screen again, accompanied by yet another voicemail notification. He finally picked up the phone, not to answer, but to silence it. The unread messages glared at him, each one a desperate plea. "Shay, Jack, come home, we need to talk." A pause, then another. "Shay, it's not what it looked like. Please, just hear me out." Jack set the phone back down, the knot in his chest tightening. The words felt hollow, insincere. He didn't need explanations for what he had already seen with his own eyes. The buzzing resumed almost immediately. This time, it was Lacey. Jack clenched his jaw as her text appeared on the screen. Lacey: "Dad, you're overreacting. We're still family." The message made his stomach churn. Family? Jack thought bitterly. Where was that loyalty last night, Lacey? Still, the words stung more than he wanted to admit. He had always worked so hard to be the kind of father Lacey could count on, and yet here they were, fractured, with no clear path forward. Jack ignored the messages, tossing his phone onto the bed and leaning back in his chair. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the weight of Shay's pleas and Lacey's indifference. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was their refusal to acknowledge the depth of the damage they'd caused. The phone buzzed again, pulling him back. Another voicemail from Shay. He stared at it for a moment before reluctantly pressing play. Her voice was soft but frantic, teetering between desperation and frustration. "Jack, please, just call me back. We need to talk about this. For us. For Lacey. You're being cold and it's not fair. It's not what it looked like. I know I messed up, but don't throw away everything we've built." Jack ended the message before it finished, letting the phone fall back to the bed with a dull thud. He ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion deepening. The truth was, he didn't feel cold. He felt numb. For now, that was all he could allow himself to feel. A crisp autumn wind greeted Jack as he stepped out of his car, the familiar driveway stretching before him like a bridge to a life he was about to sever. In his hand, the divorce papers felt heavier than they should, their weight a reminder of everything that had led to this moment. The house loomed ahead, still and silent, its outward tranquility masking the chaos within. Jack took a deep breath and walked to the front door, his steps deliberate and firm. The door opened before he could knock. Shay stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes puffy from what Jack guessed had been a sleepless night. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Then Shay's gaze fell to the envelope in Jack's hand, and her expression shifted from wary to desperate. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling as she stepped aside to let him in. "Please, you don't mean this. You're just angry, hurt. We can work through this." Jack stepped inside, his jaw tight. He placed the envelope carefully on the kitchen table, the deliberate motion leaving no room for misinterpretation. "No, Shay," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." Shay's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. "Jack, she stammered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you." Jack held her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "But you did." Over and over again. "And now, this is where we are." Shay reached for his arm, her touch tentative, pleading. "We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away. We can fix this." Jack shook his head, his voice steady but firm. "You threw it away, Shay, and I'm done trying to hold on to something that's already broken." The desperation in Shay's eyes hardened into anger. "You're going to regret this, Jack," she said, her tone sharp, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "You're ruining our family." Jack felt the words hit him, but they didn't land the way she intended. If anything, they solidified his decision. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. Shay didn't follow him. As he stepped outside and closed the door behind him, Jack felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. He didn't look back. There was no point. The life he had shared with Shay was over, and for the first time, he was ready to face what lay ahead. The decision to cut Lacey off financially weighed heavily on Jack's mind, but as he sat at his hotel desk, staring at the screen of his laptop, he knew it was the right thing to do. It wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. He had spent years providing Lacey with every privilege, every opportunity to succeed. Yet her choices had made it clear that she didn't respect the foundation those privileges were built on. Jack navigated to the online portal for her university. With a few keystrokes, he canceled the tuition payments for the upcoming semester. Next, he called the leasing agency that managed the payments on her car. After a brief but firm conversation, the lease was terminated, effective immediately. When the call ended, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "She has to learn," Jack muttered to himself. "It's time for her to stand on her own." It didn't take long for Lacey to notice. His phone buzzed, her name flashing angrily across the screen. Jack hesitated for a moment before answering, already bracing for the storm. "Dad, what's your problem?" Lacey's voice was sharp, accusatory. "You can't just cut me off like this. How am I supposed to pay for school? How am I supposed to get around?" Jack remained calm, his tone measured. "You made your choices, Lacey. Now I'm making mine." "What choices?" she shot back, her voice rising. "I didn't do anything wrong." Jack's jaw tightened, but he refused to let his frustration show. "The privileges you had, your tuition, your car, they were based on respect. Respect for me, for your mother, and for the values we raised you with. You threw that respect away when you decided none of it mattered." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the silence crackling with tension. When Lacey finally spoke, her voice was laced with bitterness. "You're ruining my life, Dad." Jack sighed. "No, Lacey, I'm giving you the chance to take responsibility for your life. It's up to you what you do with it." "Unbelievable," she muttered, and before Jack could say another word, the call ended with a sharp click. Jack set the phone down on the desk, staring at it for a long moment. He had expected anger, even resentment, but the cold dismissal in her voice still stung. Still, he knew this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about setting boundaries, about teaching her that actions, no matter how small, have consequences. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his hotel room, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Despite the hurt, Jack held on to a small flicker of hope. He believed in Lacey, even if she didn't see it yet. She was strong, smart, and capable, qualities he had always admired in her. Maybe this would be the wake-up call she needed. And if it wasn't? Well, Jack wasn't ready to give up on her. Not yet. But for now, the ball was in her court. Several days passed in relative silence, the hum of Jack's hotel room becoming an unwelcome companion. The initial flood of messages and calls from Shay and Lacey had tapered off, leaving Jack with more space to think than he cared for. He didn't regret his decisions, but the quiet forced him to confront the deeper ache of a fractured family. One morning, as he returned from a brief walk, he found a small envelope slipped under his hotel room door. His name was written in Lacey's unmistakable handwriting. The loops of her letters hurried but familiar. Jack sat on the edge of the bed, the envelope resting in his hand for a long moment before he opened it. Inside, a handwritten letter unfolded. As he began reading, the weight of her words sank in. Dad, I messed up. I didn't think you'd leave no matter what we did, but you did. Now everything feels broken. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to. Please, can we talk? Lacey. Jack read the letter twice, his throat tightening with a mix of relief and sorrow. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A crack in the wall of defiance she had built around herself. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Reaching for his phone, Jack dialed her number. The line rang twice before she picked up, her voice hesitant. Dad? Jack took a breath, keeping his tone steady but firm. Lacey, I got your letter. I'm glad you reached out. There was a pause on her end, the silence punctuated by the faint sound of her sniffing back tears. I'm sorry, Dad. For everything. I know I screwed up. Apologies are a good start, Jack replied, his voice calm but resolute. But if you're serious about fixing this, it's going to take effort, actions, not words. I understand, Lacey said quickly, her voice trembling but determined. I'll prove it, Dad. I promise. Jack closed his eyes, leaning back against the headboard. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself a small smile. All right, he said softly. We'll take this one step at a time. I'll be watching, Lacey. Thank you, she whispered, her gratitude laced with raw emotion. I won't let you down. As the call ended, Jack folded the letter carefully and placed it in his suitcase. It was a small step, but it was enough to ease the weight in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt like there was a path forward, one they could take together. Weeks passed, and while Jack focused on moving forward, Shay's world began to unravel. The glamorous social circle she had carefully curated started to shrink. Word of her infidelity spread through their tight-knit community, fueled by whispers and speculation. The same friends who once eagerly joined her for brunch or yoga now responded to her calls with excuses, their loyalty quietly shifting away. Her relationship with Max, the man who had upended her marriage, also deteriorated. The carefree excitement that had once drawn her to him fizzled under the weight of reality. Max was restless, seeking attention elsewhere, and before long, Shay discovered he'd moved on to someone younger, someone who didn't carry the baggage of a broken marriage. One morning, Jack checked his email and found a message from Shay. The subject line simply read, "We need to talk." Curious but guarded, Jack opened it. The words were a mix of anger and desperation. "You're being cold and vindictive," she had written. "You've turned everyone against me. I don't deserve this treatment, Jack. We were a family once. Don't you remember that?" Jack stared at the screen, unmoved. He closed the email without replying, shaking his head. She still doesn't get it, he thought. This isn't about revenge. This is about consequences. In stark contrast to Shay's decline, Lacey was slowly finding her footing. After their heart-to-heart, she had taken Jack's words to heart, determined to prove herself. She secured a part-time job at a local cafe, balancing her shifts with her schoolwork. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and Jack could see the small but significant changes in her demeanor. Lacey also began reaching out to him in unexpected ways. One evening, Jack returned to his hotel room to find a simple, home-cooked meal waiting for him, the smell of roasted vegetables and baked chicken filling the air. Lacey sat at the small dining table, nervously adjusting her apron. "I thought I'd cook dinner for us," she said, her voice soft but hopeful. "I've been learning from a few videos online. It's not perfect, but—" Jack smiled, genuinely touched. "It's perfect," he said, sitting down and savoring the first bite. For the first time in a long while, the tension between them felt like it was starting to ease. Another surprise came a few weeks later. Lacey stopped by his temporary apartment, holding a neatly wrapped package. "This is for you," she said, handing it over with a shy smile. Jack unwrapped it carefully, revealing a framed photo of Lacey at an award ceremony. She stood proudly, holding a certificate of achievement for a volunteer program she'd recently joined. "I wanted you to have this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I know I've messed up a lot, but I'm trying to do better, and I wanted to show you that." Jack stared at the photo, his throat tightening. "Thank you, Lacey," he said, his voice thick with pride. "You've come a long way, and I'm proud of you." Lacey beamed, the weight of their strained relationship lifting, if only a little. "Thanks for giving me a second chance, Dad," she said earnestly. "I won't waste it." Jack nodded, his chest swelling with hope. "Just keep at it," he replied. "Actions, not words, remember?" Lacey grinned. "I remember." As they sat down together to talk, Jack realized something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The journey with Lacey was far from over, but it was a start. For now, that was enough. Jack was in the middle of reviewing a work presentation when his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen. Shay's name flashed across it. He debated letting it go to voicemail, but sighed and answered, bracing himself. "Jack," Shay's voice came through, strained and unsteady. "I need to talk to you." "What is it, Shay?" he asked, his tone measured but distant. She hesitated for a moment before diving in. "I've hit a rough patch. Things haven't been easy since everything. I need support." Jack leaned back in his chair, letting her words sink in. He wasn't surprised. He had seen the signs in her earlier emails, the unraveling of her carefully constructed life. Still, hearing her ask for help felt like a strange reversal of roles. Once he might have jumped to her aid without question. Now he knew better. "You need to figure this out on your own," Jack said firmly, though not without a tinge of sympathy. "I can't be the one to fix this for you." Shay's breath caught on the other end of the line, and for a moment he thought she might argue. But instead her voice softened, heavy with defeat. "I don't know how to, Jack. Everything's falling apart." "You'll find a way," Jack replied. "You have to." There was a long silence before Shay spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I've been thinking about seeing a counselor. Maybe it's time." "That's a good start," Jack said. "Do it for yourself, Shay, not for anyone else." The call ended soon after, leaving Jack with a mix of emotions. He wasn't sure if Shay would follow through, but for the first time, she seemed willing to confront her own choices. That was something, at least. Meanwhile, Lacey continued to surprise Jack. Her job at the cafe, while modest, had become a source of pride for her. She threw herself into her work and her volunteer activities, often staying late to help wherever she was needed. The transformation in her attitude was undeniable, and Jack couldn't have been prouder. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner in his apartment, Lacey began to open up. "You know, Dad," she said, twirling a fork through her salad, "it feels good, you know? Doing something meaningful, helping people, earning my way. It's different, but in a good way." Jack smiled, setting down his glass. "That mindset will take you far, Lacey," he said warmly. "You've worked hard to get here. I hope you're proud of yourself, because I am." Lacey beamed, her confidence growing with every small step she took. "Thanks, Dad. I finally feel like I'm on the right track." As they continued their conversation, Jack felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Lacey wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Her growth was a testament to her resilience and willingness to change. For Jack, it was the silver lining in an otherwise tumultuous chapter of his life. In that moment, he knew they were both heading toward a brighter future, one built on trust, accountability, and mutual respect. And for now, that was more than enough. It was a crisp afternoon when Shay reached out to Jack, asking to meet in person. The request surprised him, but he agreed, meeting her at a quiet cafe they used to frequent years ago. Jack arrived first, nursing a cup of coffee as he stared out the window, reflecting on everything that had brought them to this point. When Shay walked in, he barely recognized her. The once vibrant, confident woman now looked weary, her movements hesitant. "Jack," she said softly, sliding into the chair across from him. For a moment, she avoided his gaze, fidgeting with the edge of her coat. Then she looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and resignation. "I know I've lost everything, and I'm sorry for how I handled things, for how I hurt you." Her words hung in the air, vulnerable and raw. Jack studied her for a moment, his expression calm but unreadable. He had spent countless nights imagining what this conversation might be like, but now that it was happening, he felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Just a quiet sense of closure. "I appreciate your honesty, Shay," he said, his voice steady, "but we're long past the point of going back." Shay nodded, her shoulders slumping, as if she had expected his response but had needed to hear it anyway. "I don't blame you," she murmured. I wanted to say it out loud. To own up to it." Jack gave a small nod, his gaze softening slightly. "That means something. It really does. But we've both got to move on." As they parted ways outside the cafe, Shay lingered for a moment, as if trying to hold on to something intangible. Finally, she stepped away, leaving Jack with a quiet sense of finality. It was over, not just their marriage, but the emotional hold it had once had over him. Back home, Jack and Lacey continued rebuilding their relationship, one step at a time. It wasn't perfect, but the effort they both put in made all the difference. Lacey had transformed from the defiant teenager he had confronted weeks ago into a young woman determined to make amends. One evening, as they sat on the couch sharing takeout, Lacey turned to Jack, her expression sincere. "Thanks for not giving up on me, Dad," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with pride. "I'll always fight for you, Lacey," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "But you've got to meet me halfway." Lacey nodded, smiling through the tears that welled in her eyes. "I will. I promise." As the weeks turned into months, Jack found himself reflecting on everything they had been through. The pain, the betrayal, the hard lessons. They had all shaped him into someone stronger, more resolute. He had learned to set boundaries, to prioritize his own well-being, and to let go of the things he couldn't control. And in the process, he had rediscovered the power of hope and resilience. For Lacey, the journey was equally transformative. She had learned that respect wasn't something to be taken for granted. It was earned through actions, not words. Her part-time job and volunteer work gave her a newfound sense of purpose, and her relationship with Jack became a source of strength rather than conflict. On a sunny Saturday morning, Jack stood on his porch, sipping coffee as he watched Lacey pack up her car. She was headed to a weekend retreat for her volunteer group, her excitement palpable. "See you Monday," she called out, waving as she drove off. Jack smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were on solid ground. As he turned to go back inside, Jack glanced at the framed photo of him and Lacey on the hallway table, a new one she had given him, taken at a recent community event. It wasn't just a picture. It was a symbol of how far they had come. And as the door closed behind him, Jack carried with him a quiet but profound truth, that even in the wake of heartbreak, it's possible to rebuild, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it and choosing to move forward.